It began with a knock on the door in the dead of night. A family in Moscow, sleeping peacefully, would hear the dreaded sound. Heavy boots in the stairwell, harsh voices. The father would know immediately what it meant. There was no time to pack, no time to say proper goodbyes. Within minutes, he would be gone, loaded into a black van, and driven into the darkness. By morning, it would be as if he had never existed. His name would be struck from records, his photographs removed from family albums, his very existence erased from Soviet history. This was the Great Terror, and at its heart was an NKVD operation so systematic, so ruthlessly efficient, that it made hundreds of thousands of people disappear overnight. This operation had a name, Order Number 00447, and it represented state terror elevated to an industrial scale. To understand this operation, we must first understand the NKVD itself and the man who commanded it during its darkest period. The NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, was the Soviet Union's secret police force, successor to the Cheka and predecessor to the KGB. By the mid-1930s, it had become the primary instrument of Joseph Stalin's terror. At its head was Nikolai Yezhov, a diminutive man barely 5 feet tall, who would give his name to the period, the Yezhovshchina. Yezhov was appointed head of the NKVD in September 1936, replacing Genrikh Yagoda, who had himself been arrested and would eventually be executed. This was typical of the period. The hunters became the hunted. The executioners were themselves executed. The atmosphere in the Soviet Union by 1937 was one of paranoia, fear, and conspiracy theories elevated to state policy. Stalin believed, or claimed to believe, that the Soviet Union was riddled with enemies, saboteurs, spies, and traitors who were working to undermine the socialist state. The roots of the Great Terror lay in Stalin's consolidation of power and his paranoid worldview. The assassination of Sergei Kirov in December 1934 had been used as a pretext for the first wave of arrests. The show trials of 1936 and 1937 had eliminated old Bolsheviks, former opposition leaders, and anyone who might challenge Stalin's authority. Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, and others were forced to confess to fantastic conspiracies and then executed. But these high-profile cases were just the visible tip of a much larger operation. On July 30, 1937, the Politburo approved Order Number 00447, titled, On the Operation to Repress Former Kulaks, Criminals, and Other Anti-Soviet Elements. This was the operational directive for the mass terror that would consume the Soviet Union over the next 2 years. The order was signed by Yezhov and sent to NKVD chiefs throughout the Soviet Union. It was classified as top secret, and its existence would not be officially acknowledged for over 50 years. Order 00447 was remarkable for its bureaucratic precision and its genocidal scope. It divided victims into 2 categories. Category 1 prisoners were to be shot immediately. Category 2 prisoners were to be sent to labor camps for 8 to 10 years. The order established quotas for each region, specifying exactly how many people were to be arrested and how many were to be executed. This wasn't random terror. This was planned, systematized, industrialized repression. The targets were defined broadly, almost impossibly broadly. Former kulaks, the wealthy peasants who had been dispossessed during collectivization, were primary targets. But the order also targeted criminals, former members of anti-Soviet political parties, former White Army officers, religious sectarians, former nobles, and anyone who had ever been exiled or imprisoned. In practice, almost anyone could be arrested under these categories. The definitions were so vague that they could be stretched to include virtually any Soviet citizen. The quotas were the most chilling aspect of the order. Moscow region was assigned a quota of 5,000 for Category 1 and 30,000 for Category 2. Ukraine received similar numbers. Every region in the Soviet Union was given targets to meet. Local NKVD chiefs were expected to fulfill these quotas, and many exceeded them, requesting authorization to arrest and execute even more people. This created a perverse incentive structure where NKVD officers competed to demonstrate their vigilance by arresting and executing more victims. The operation began on August 5, 1937. Across the Soviet Union, NKVD operatives began making arrests according to prepared lists. The arrests followed a pattern that would become terribly familiar. They typically happened at night, between midnight and dawn. A knock on the door, sometimes preceded by surveillance to ensure the target was home. When the door opened, NKVD officers would push inside, often with weapons drawn. The arrest itself was quick and efficient. The victim would be told they were being taken for questioning. They were allowed to take minimal belongings, sometimes just the clothes on their back. The NKVD would often search the apartment, looking for incriminating evidence, which could be anything from foreign literature to old photographs to letters from relatives abroad. Frequently, evidence was planted, if none was found. The family left behind faced immediate consequences. Wives of arrested men could be arrested themselves as members of families of traitors to the motherland. Children could be sent to orphanages, their names changed, their parentage erased. Neighbors would often avoid the families of the arrested, fearing guilt by association. People would cross the street to avoid speaking to the wife of an enemy of the people. The arrested were taken to NKVD facilities, usually local headquarters, or specially designated prisons. There, they entered a nightmare world of interrogation, torture, and forced confessions. The NKVD used what they called the conveyor system. Prisoners would be interrogated continuously by teams of interrogators working in shifts. The prisoner was denied sleep, food was withheld, physical abuse was common. The goal was to obtain a confession, regardless of truth. The confessions followed standard templates. Prisoners would be forced to admit to sabotage, espionage, participation in counter-revolutionary organizations, or plots to assassinate Soviet leaders. The interrogators had quotas too. They needed confessions to justify the arrests and to implicate others, creating networks of conspiracy that could justify further arrests. Many prisoners signed false confessions simply to end the torture, or in the hope that cooperation might save their lives or protect their families. The legal process was a mockery of justice. Prisoners were tried by troikas, three-person tribunals consisting of local NKVD chiefs, Communist Party officials, and prosecutors. These were not real trials. There were no defense attorneys, no presentation of evidence, no opportunity for the accused to speak in their own defense. The troikas would review cases for minutes, sometimes seconds, before rendering judgment. The proceedings were secret. Families were not informed. For those sentenced to Category 1, death came quickly after the Troika's decision. Executions were carried out by NKVD officers using pistols, typically shooting victims in the back of the head in prison basements or specially designated execution sites. The bodies were disposed of in mass graves, often in remote locations or at night to maintain secrecy. Families were told nothing or were informed months or years later that their relative had been sentenced to 10 years in camps without right of correspondence, a euphemism that actually meant execution. The scale of the killing was staggering. In the first 4 months of the operation, from August to November 1937, over 200,000 people were arrested under Order 00447, and over 100,000 were executed. The operation was supposed to end in December 1937, but it was extended multiple times. Regional NKVD chiefs requested increases in their quotas, and these were usually approved. The terror had its own momentum. What made people disappear overnight wasn't just the speed of the arrests, but the systematic erasure of their existence. The Soviet state went to extraordinary lengths to eliminate all traces of victims. Records were destroyed or falsified. Photographs were removed from official pictures. Names were struck from lists and documents. In group photographs, the faces of purge victims were sometimes physically removed, leaving strange gaps where people had once stood. Families participated in this erasure out of fear. They removed photographs of arrested relatives from their homes. They stopped mentioning their names. They denied knowing them. This wasn't cowardice, it was survival. Association with an enemy of the people could be fatal. Children were taught to deny their fathers. Wives renounced their husbands. The social fabric of Soviet society was torn apart by fear and mutual denunciation. The terror spread beyond the initial targets. Order 00447 was followed by other orders targeting specific groups. Order 00485 targeted wives of enemies of the people. Order 00486 targeted the Polish minority in the Soviet Union. Other orders targeted Germans, Koreans, Chinese, and other ethnic groups. The NKVD developed a routine for mass repression. Each operation had its quotas, its categories, its predetermined victims. The ethnic operations were particularly brutal. The Polish operation alone resulted in over 111,000 executions. The targets were Soviet citizens of Polish ethnicity, Polish communists who had fled to the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s, anyone with Polish connections or Polish-sounding names. The charge was typically espionage for Poland, a country that many of the victims had never visited and whose language they sometimes didn't even speak. The NKVD officers carrying out these operations were themselves often victims. Many of the regional NKVD chiefs who had overseen the terror were arrested and executed in 1938 and 1939. Yezhov himself was arrested in April 1939, tortured and executed in February 1940. His replacement, Lavrenti Beria, would oversee the final phase of the terror, and then use the purge of NKVD personnel as a way to shift blame away from Stalin and onto the security apparatus itself. The human cost of Order 00447 and the associated operations is difficult to calculate precisely. Soviet archives suggest that approximately 1.5 million people were arrested during the Great Terror, and approximately 700,000 were executed. These are conservative estimates. The true numbers may be higher. In addition to those executed, hundreds of thousands more died in labor camps, during transport, or from the consequences of arrest and exile. But the numbers alone don't capture the full horror. This was a society terrorizing itself under state direction. The NKVD used ordinary citizens as informants. Denunciations became a way of settling personal scores, obtaining someone's apartment, or demonstrating political loyalty. People denounced colleagues, neighbors, even family members. The atmosphere was one of pervasive suspicion, where any word could be interpreted as counter-revolutionary. The methods used to make people disappear were refined to a terrible efficiency. The NKVD developed standard procedures for arrests, interrogations, executions, and disposal of bodies. They created forms and paperwork for mass murder. They established quotas and timetables. They treated the destruction of human lives as an administrative task, to be carried out with bureaucratic thoroughness. One of the most chilling aspects of the operation was the involvement of ordinary people in the machinery of terror. The NKVD couldn't have functioned without a vast network of informants, collaborators, and participants. Building managers kept track of residents and reported suspicious activity. Co-workers denounced each other. Communist Party members participated in meetings where they voted to expel members, knowing this often meant arrest. The show trials that accompanied the mass terror served a different purpose than the secret operations. High-profile trials of old Bolsheviks and military leaders were public spectacles designed to legitimize the terror and to demonstrate the omnipresence of enemies. But Order 00447 and similar operations were secret, their existence denied. The public knew people were being arrested and disappearing, but they didn't know the scale, the quotas, or the systematic nature of the repression. The impact on Soviet society was profound and lasting. Entire professions were decimated. The military high command was gutted, with 3 of 5 marshals executed, 13 of 15 army commanders executed, and thousands of officers arrested. This would have catastrophic consequences when Germany invaded in 1941. The Communist Party itself lost hundreds of thousands of members. The intelligentsia, engineers, scientists, writers, and artists suffered heavily. The terror also affected the NKVD itself in unexpected ways. The constant purges and executions created a culture of fear, even within the security apparatus. NKVD officers knew they could become victims at any moment. This created a vicious cycle where officers tried to demonstrate their loyalty by arresting more people, which in turn fed the terror. Some officers became alcoholics or suffered psychological breakdowns from the killings they carried out. The execution sites became killing fields. Places like Butovo near Moscow, Komunarka, and Levashovo near Leningrad saw tens of thousands of executions. Bodies were buried in mass graves, often multiple layers deep. These sites were kept secret for decades. Even today, not all execution sites have been identified or excavated. The victims were buried without markers, their graves lost. For the families left behind, the disappearance of loved ones created a particular kind of anguish. Not knowing if their relative was dead or alive, unable to mourn, forbidden to even speak the person's name. Many families waited for decades, hoping their loved one would return from the camps. Some did return, but most never did. The rehabilitation of victims didn't begin in earnest until after Stalin's death in 1953, and many were not officially exonerated until the late 1980s. The operation began to wind down in 1938, not because of any moral qualms, but because it had achieved its purpose and was becoming counterproductive. The Soviet economy was suffering from the loss of trained personnel. The military weakness caused by the purges was becoming apparent. Stalin decided the terror had gone far enough, though he never acknowledged his role in initiating it. The end of the mass operations came with Order number 00762 in November 1938, which dissolved the troikas and ended the quota system. But arrests and executions continued, just at a lower intensity. The NKVD itself was purged, with Yezhov and many of his subordinates arrested and executed. Beria, the new NKVD chief, reviewed cases and released some prisoners, though he also oversaw continued repression. The official narrative shifted. The excesses of the terror were blamed on Yezhov, and overzealous local NKVD officers who had exceeded their authority. Stalin's role was obscured. This narrative would persist in the Soviet Union even after Stalin's death. Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin in 1956 acknowledged the terror, but didn't fully reveal its systematic nature or Stalin's personal involvement. The victims of Order 00447 and related operations remained non-persons for decades. Their families lived under suspicion as relatives of enemies of the people. Many survivors of the camps never spoke about their experiences, either from trauma or continued fear. The full scale of the terror only became known after the opening of Soviet archives in the 1990s. What lessons can be drawn from this operation that made people disappear overnight? First, it demonstrates how quickly a state can turn against its own citizens when power is concentrated and unchecked. The Soviet Union in 1936 was not at war, faced no immediate external threat, yet it consumed hundreds of thousands of its own people. Second, it shows the danger of ideology taken to extremes. The belief in hidden enemies, in the necessity of class struggle, in the purification of society through violence, these ideas provided the intellectual justification for mass murder. The victims weren't killed for what they had done, but for who they were or were accused of being. Third, the operation revealed the banality of evil. To use Hannah Arendt's phrase, the terror was carried out not by sadistic monsters, though sadists certainly participated, but by ordinary bureaucrats following orders, filling quotas, and processing paperwork. Mass murder was reduced to an administrative task. Fourth, the use of quotas and targets turned terror into a competitive exercise. Local officials tried to exceed their quotas to demonstrate loyalty. This created a self-perpetuating system where more arrests led to more interrogations, which produced more denunciations, which led to more arrests. Fifth, the operation showed how terror destroys social trust. When anyone could be an informant, when denunciation could come from family members or friends, society atomized. People retreated into silence and isolation. The social capital that holds societies together was systematically destroyed. The long-term consequences of the Great Terror shaped Soviet society for generations. The demographic impact was significant, with the loss of educated professionals, military leaders, and skilled workers. The psychological impact was profound, creating a culture of fear and conformity that persisted long after Stalin's death. The moral impact undermined the legitimacy of the Soviet system itself. The operation also had international implications. The purge of foreign communists who had sought refuge in the Soviet Union disillusioned many international supporters. The execution of military leaders weakened the Soviet Union's ability to resist Nazi Germany. The terror created a legacy of suffering that complicated Soviet relations with neighboring countries. For historians, Order 00447 and the associated operations represent a challenge. How do you write history when the perpetrators systematically destroyed records and obscured their crimes? How do you count victims when many arrest records were falsified or destroyed? How do you tell individual stories when entire archives of personal documents were eliminated? Memorial, the Russian human rights organization dedicated to documenting Soviet repression, has worked for decades to identify victims and preserve their memory. They have compiled databases with millions of names, collected testimonies from survivors and families, and marked execution sites. Their work represents an attempt to counter the disappearance, to restore names and faces to the victims. The physical sites of the terror are slowly being recognized. Execution sites have been marked with memorials. Former NKVD prisons have become museums. In Moscow, the Wall of Grief Memorial commemorates victims of political persecution. These memorials represent a belated acknowledgement of what happened, though debates continue about how to remember this history. What made Order 00447 so effective at making people disappear overnight was its combination of surprise, speed, and systematic erasure. Victims had no warning, no opportunity to flee or resist. The arrests happened so quickly that people vanished before their communities could react. And the erasure of records and memory meant that even the fact of their existence could be questioned. The operation also worked because it exploited human psychology. The suddenness of the arrests created shock. The secrecy created uncertainty. The threat of guilt by association isolated victims' families. The use of forced confessions created false validation for the arrests. The whole system was designed to break resistance and normalize the terror. In the end, Order 00447 and the Great Terror represent one of the darkest chapters in 20th century history. An operation that made hundreds of thousands of people disappear overnight, that turned a state against its own citizens, that industrialized murder and systematized repression. The victims were teachers, engineers, farmers, workers, party members, soldiers, parents, and children. They were disappeared not for anything they had done, but because a totalitarian system required victims to sustain itself. The knock on the door in the middle of the night became a defining image of Soviet terror. For millions of families, it was the last time they saw their loved ones. For survivors, it was a trauma that lasted a lifetime. For historians, it remains a challenge to document fully. And for humanity, it stands as a warning about what happens when power is unchecked, when ideology justifies atrocity, and when human life becomes merely a statistic in a bureaucratic operation. The people who disappeared overnight under Order 00447 are slowly being remembered. Their names are being recovered from archives. Their stories are being told. The execution sites are being marked. This work of remembrance is itself a form of resistance against the erasure that the NKVD tried to impose. The victims are no longer non-persons. They are being restored to history, and their disappearance is being recognized for what it was. Not the elimination of enemies, but the murder of innocence by a criminal state.